Good evening, everybody. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Before we begin our webinar tonight, or this morning, if you happen to be in London or the UK, before we begin our meeting, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia, recognising their continued connection to land, water and culture, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. This is the third in our series of international research webinars where we've invited very famous and very able to articulate their research academics around the world to come and speak to the China Studies Centre here. Today, we're very lucky to have persuaded Professor Astrid Norden from King's College London to come and talk about international relations, which is her speciality, and the impact, as you know, of past culture and philosophy on the way that international relations can be interpreted. So without further ado, over to her. But before I do that, Astrid is going to speak first, and then there'll be a period for questions and answers afterwards. Because we're doing this through a webinar, the best way to do it is, if you wish to pose a question, please place it in the question and answer box within the Zoom facility, and I will read out the questions towards the end. We find this is a better way to do it. Okay, so now over to you, Astrid. The floor, as they say, the webinar is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, David. I'm going to share my screen, so hold on, bear with me for a minute. There we go. Can you all see that fine? Good. Okay. So I first of all want to thank David for the introduction and for the invitation to come and speak to you here. Good morning, everybody, or good evening, wherever you are. And I wanted to take the opportunity of this really important juncture at which we find ourselves to speak to you in the context of COP26, which is of course ongoing here in the UK. And I think that this is a really important moment because we've got leaders meeting up in Glasgow, not far from where I am, and they are, I think, really feeling the crunch, that this is really kind of make or break time. And I think for most of us, we've by now experienced quite directly the consequences of climate change and global environmental degradation, whether that's in the form of fires or in the form of floods or something else. And as water levels rise, so do voices calling for a radical rethinking of our approaches to planetary politics. So I thought I'd take as a point of departure for my talk to you today this conjuncture at which we find ourselves for talking about China and its relations to the rest of the world. Because many of the dominant voices that are heard on the topic over the last few weeks have engaged in a kind of state-based blame game that pits China against the West. So we hear that more decisive action by the Chinese state is absolutely key to addressing the problem of global warming, as the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, accounting for more than the rest of the developed world combined. And some see President Xi Jinping's absence from COP26 as a sign that China just isn't doing enough. Now, at the same time, many in China, of course, suggest that it's Western ideas and practices that put us in the difficult place we find us in the first place. So states like the early industrializing UK reaped the benefits of polluting, carbon guzzling industrial revolution, and is not doing enough to provide the resources to now help up help tidy up the mess that we made. So in this short time that we have together today, I want to place these claims in the context of broader discussions about what is thought about Chinese and Western thought. And I'll outline what I call a pluralist relational approach to planetary challenges like climate change, which can help us think differently about our current impasse. So it's self-evidently true that the approaches that have dominated thinking about climate change in the world and relationships therein are based largely on what is thought of as Western terminology and traditions of thought. They've been used to think more about a specific set of European and American concerns than about problems facing others elsewhere. Now, in this context, Western-centrism of our most common approaches is increasingly recognized as a problem. Because its divisions and marginalisation of non-Western others devalues those others and their concerns, including some suggest in climate change negotiations. And it's well established that this type of thinking, where an imagined we takes precedence or priority over an equally imagined them, has been complicit in both symbolic and physical violence, not least in the form of colonialism. That's also bound up in the destruction of traditional and arguably more sustainable ways of life. Now, there have been many different responses to this Western-centrism from all parts of the world. And one Chinese response has been to suggest that China has a better set of ideas and values for thinking about relations between humans and the world, between humans and nature. A biodiversity-focused COP15 a few weeks ago, the joint declaration that was signed in Kunming was named after Xi Jinping's slogan, ecological civilization. And concepts derived from pre-modern Chinese thought are said to offer a superior alternative to the violence of Western-centric theory. Now, the irony, as I'm sure hasn't escaped you, is this claim to superiority and dismissal of Western thought mirrors exactly the logic that was supposed to be the problem in the first place. Replacing Western-centrism with Sino-centrism may reverse a problematic hierarchy, but it does nothing about the structure itself. It just places somebody else at the top of the pecking order. So just as Western-centric approaches dismiss or marginalise Chinese thought, so too do Chinese-centric approaches dismiss Western thought. Now, the dilemma is that we must live and act and theorise in a shared world, or even if we think of these diverse traditions as embodying multiple worlds, as we might do, we need a language to bridge those worlds. In the rest of my talk today, I'll suggest to you an approach that can help us rethink this bridging of Western and Chinese traditions for thinking about climate change and planetary relations. So I'll talk to you about the opportunities and challenges of developing what I call a pluralist relational approach that my research aims to develop, test, and apply in the context of urgent planetary challenges like climate change. My talk will progress in 3 parts. In the first part, I will outline the basic proposition of relational thinking. And I'll suggest that most current thinking about relationality remains trapped in the mutually reinforcing denigration of Western-centrism and Sino-centrism, but that these debates provide us with rich resources for an approach that can get us out of that deadlock. In the second part, I will put to you what I think are more promising points of departure for a pluralist relational approach that aims to bridge both of these sets of thinking and to move away from the colonial logic that they are stuck in. And in the third part, by way of conclusion, I will return to comment on how such an approach can help us address our dilemma of acting and thinking in a way that accommodates but also bridges a diversity of geolinguistic traditions of thought, like those associated with China and the West as we approach climate change. So first of all, then, what does it mean to take a relational approach? At its most fundamental, it means starting our analyses by looking at relationships. So most approaches to climate change negotiations, or indeed to international relations more broadly, start by imagining the international as consisting of states, civilizations, individuals, or other things that first exist and then come together to interact and exert power on each other, and so on. In a relational approach, states, civilizations, and individuals aren't really understood as independently existing things anymore, but as temporary effects of relations. So we start our analysis by looking at the relations. So, for example, by virtue of us being here together and me presenting my ideas to you, I become a presenter and you become an audience. But if I weren't also here, if you weren't also here, acting as an audience, then and turning up to my presentation and listening and engaging, I wouldn't be a presenter at all. I'd just be a weirdo talking to the screen on my own. And likewise, you wouldn't be an audience if I stopped presenting. You went to have a cup of tea instead. So in this moment, we are what we are, only in relation to one another. And of course, in not very long, I'll stop talking and I'll stop being presenter. You'll stop being my audience. Maybe I'll listen to somebody else's talk and I'll become somebody else's audience. So this is just one example to illustrate how all identities or positions are impossible or meaningless unless they are performed in a relation with others. And approaches that start their analyses by looking at relations in this way are less common in both lay and academic discussions of climate change and of international relations more broadly than approaches that take things as the given starting point. But of course, I'm not the first person to think in relational terms, and indeed Chinese traditions of thought have a really rich set of resources for this type of thinking. And an illustrative example, philosophical example, can be seen in the Daoist yin-yang symbol. So here, as many of you will be familiar, a light half and a dark half together form a circle. Originally expressed through the metaphor of light and shadow moving over a mountain, the darkness is only dark relative to the light. Thinking of light as light only makes sense if you have a related concept of darkness. So light and dark aren't essential properties, they are mutually constitutive qualities. And in addition, of course, the light dot in the dark and the dark dot in the light emphasize that neither of these relationally constituted qualities is complete or unambiguous. There is always an element of darkness in the light, and there is always light in the dark. So this is only one example of the kind of philosophical resource that Chinese traditions offer us for relational thinking. And indeed, a number of prominent Chinese colleagues, some of them are collaborators of mine, have built their careers on the argument that this type of relational thinking should be China's contribution to the study of international relations. And they suggest that it should form the hard core of Chinese school of IR. So this is what people like Xinjiang would argue. So Chinese relationality, he argues, can overcome the violence and imperialism that has been associated with Western rationality and the unit-based thinking of the international state system. Now, the problem I have with their way of deploying a relational approach is that they portray it as a fundamentally Chinese way of thinking, superior to the analysis in terms of things that is said to be fundamentally Western. This is a problem, I think, for two key reasons. It's a problem because casting relationality as superior and Chinese repeats the colonial logic of a Western-centric thought that relationality was supposed to overcome. So on this view, Chinese people have some kind of privileged access to this superior way of understanding what's good for the world and for the environment. And they understand what's good better than others. So it's easy to recognize this type of patronizing thinking as precisely the logic that's been used to motivate and justify colonialism and its violence. Another problem, if you're trying to claim that relational thinking is essentially Chinese, is that you have to really hold back your own thinking. If you want to portray relationality as something that Westerners can't or won't do, you have to ignore the equally rich tradition of relational thinking that has come out of critical discourse associated with the West. So there's a range of thinking here that foregrounds relations like social network approaches, deconstruction, and variants of feminism, for example. So these approaches resonate with yin-yang thinking. And they also offer, I think, significant challenges and I think potential ways forward for a relational approach that dominates the Chinese school. Now, I won't dwell at length on this potential here, but let me give you a couple of examples. So feminist theories, for example, can help us challenge the romanticization of patriarchal hierarchy that Confucian-influenced approaches to ecological civilizations take as a model for understanding good relations. They can help us steer away from its paternalistic colonial impulse. Deconstruction, as another example, is similar to yin-yang thinking in that it shows how presumed opposites imply one another and were never mutually exclusive in the first place. Because it values the resulting incoherence, it resists the suggestion sometimes made in Daoist-inspired approaches that everything and anything needs to be subsumed into a coherent and harmonious whole. So again, this helps us resist the colonial impulse, which demands that everybody else should either become like ourselves or be denigrated as inferior and controlled as such. So yet, despite these resources and the potential for bridging, I think that many of these critical approaches remain obsessed with the West. So elsewhere I've written about how the key proponent of deconstruction, Jacques Derrida, for example, claims that democracy is the only system that is alive and has an open future. Now, if you think that, why would you bother engaging with anything else, since politics is presumably pointless in a dead system with no future? So the problem of Western-centrism is very real in these critical relational approaches. Just like relational thinking in China has largely ignored Western relational thought, scholars who develop relational thinking in Europe and America have largely failed to listen to the Chinese debate. So what I'm trying to illustrate in this first part of my talk is that we find ourselves at a point where we have some really excellent and exciting resources for developing a relational approach that moves beyond a colonial logic where others have to become like ourselves or be excluded in our efforts to deal with planetary challenges like climate change. Now, these resources are being discussed in both China and the West, but as more or less separate debates that are Western-centric and Sino-centric, respectively. They provide the building blocks for bridging the two conversations, but their respective exceptionalism has so far prevented them from building that bridge. Recently, I made some efforts to try to do something about this gap in a project that brings scholars from the two traditions together, but that conversation is only just beginning. So to my mind, we're facing a really clear and worthwhile task in bridging these two and getting them to learn from one another. So that's the point of departure for my research agenda. And in that research, I want to continue pursuing my development of a pluralist relational approach that enables a bridging and critical mutual understanding of different traditions in our approach to planetary challenges like climate change, but that resists the colonial urge to subsume them all into one harmonious whole. Now, in this next part of my talk, I outline 5 independent pillars that I suggest can support this type of bridge building. Pillar number 1. A pluralist relational approach takes relations to be the fundamental building blocks of the world. We can still talk about states, civilizations, and identities, but these are understood as temporary effects of performed relationships. To the extent that we ascribe characteristics to these effects, they are partial and dependent on the relational context in which they are performed. So we don't ask, for example, whether China is or isn't a responsible great power in climate negotiations. Instead, we see how claims about responsibility and irresponsibility are deployed in specific relationships, drawing on specific traditions of understanding and for the purpose of shaping specific relationships through behavioral change. Pillar number 2. A pluralist relational approach shifts the register from either or to both and. Rather than understand relations and their effects as expressing either one quality or the other, it highlights the ways in which they can embody both one quality and its opposite simultaneously. So on this view, we come to see Chinese climate policy, for example, not as benevolently caring or as selfishly controlling, but as simultaneously both. So we might see how, for example, Xi Jinping, in the context of one relationship or relational performance, suggests that controlling behavior by the Chinese state is a form of benevolent care, for example, towards resource-rich special administrative regions in China. In a different relationship or relational performance, we can see him arguing that the best way that China can act responsibly towards the world is to take responsibility for itself, so that looking after its own climate interests becomes a way of caring for the rest of the world. So again, these narratives don't make any sense in isolation. They are performances deployed in specific relationships in order to shape those relationships. Brings us to pillar number 3. A pluralist relational approach typically works through detailed empirical co-creation methods in conversation with stakeholders to address wider planetary challenges. This kind of detailed ground level empirical work enables us to explore how alternative futures and indeed other ways of relating are being imagined and enacted through specific relational performances. These alternatives can be read alongside one another in ways that make us see new possibilities. And this method can help us see how habitual ways of understanding specific problems and relationships could be challenged and changed, such as that involved in the climate blame game by which we started our talk today. This method works at a grounded empirical level, but it can help us engage creatively in the kind of big picture thinking that I believe is necessary if we want to respond more creatively to planetary challenges when we have begun to feel like we're stuck with them. And though I've discussed this approach with you here today as a rather abstract philosophical type of debate, it doesn't just help us to address the particular dilemma that we've been thinking through, but it can provide a kind of toolkit that can be adapted and used with a wide range and variety of problems and stakeholders. So, for example, I'm currently working with Chinese and European startups to think about how we can build better and create more sustainable food systems after COVID. And the pluralist relational approach gives them a really different vantage point for thinking about how to do that. In a different project, I'm talking to European diplomats about how they can respond to Chinese diplomatic expressions of anger, including, for example, anger about perceived patronizing comments about China's target to reach carbon neutrality by 2060 rather than converging with the UK's 2050 target. And a pluralist relational approach can help these diplomats think about strategies for negotiating their relationship with China in this emotional context. Pillar number 4. So it can provide new ways of thinking about big planetary challenges. A pluralist relational approach resists the urge to provide a one-size-fits-all solution to them. So in my work, I use my expertise in Chinese language and political thought, not as a ready-made framework, but as a starting point that I try to critically contrast and put in conversation with a range of other contexts. So this is a strategy that resists the urge to replace one all-encompassing meta-theory with another, or indeed one empire with another. Importantly, the point is not to replace thinking that starts from imagining things with thinking that starts from imagining relations. The point is that thinking that starts with things is so overwhelmingly common and is implicated in a number of problems, including Western-centrism and Sino-centrism as such, when we're thinking about problems like climate change. So in that context, a relational approach can shake things up and I think help us see new possibilities. So we don't say either one or the other, we say both one and the other. Finally, pillar number 5, a pluralist relational approach learns from different times and places to critique the present and the planetary futures that are imagined in it. It draws on distinct traditions associated with China and the West, but emerges with something that isn't reducible to either of them. And so, of course, Chinese and Western people aren't the only ones who have thought about humans and environments from the starting point of relations. So we also learn from relational thinking in Africa, the Andes, and Japan, for example. And in this way, a pluralist relational approach decenters Western traditions for thinking about planetary politics without necessarily discarding them. So these are my proposed 5 pillars that can support the development of a pluralist relational approach to the environment and climate change as a form of relational bridge building in a context dominated by Western-centric and Sino-centric approaches. To repeat, these pillars suggest that such an approach takes relations to be the fundamental building blocks of the world. It shifts the register from either or to both and. It typically works through detailed empirical co-creation methods with stakeholders to address wider planetary challenges. It resists the urge to provide a one-size-fits-all solution to those challenges. And finally, it learns from different times and places to critique the present and the planetary futures that are imagined in it. So, time for me to wrap up and conclude and open up to our Q&A, but let me briefly summarize what I've said before adding a final thought. So we started with a kind of question. How does a relational outlook provide us with a different approach to our original dilemma? It's how to bridge the divide between Western-centric and Sino-centric understandings of planetary futures. First, relationality enables us to see that both China and the West and their thought constitute and construct one another through narratives of the environment and climate change, and through other narratives too. Many of the more detailed empirical works that we kind of see milling about in relation to COP26 at the moment, I think illustrate this point very clearly. And the superiority of the West in these accounts can only be imagined with the purported inferiority of China and vice versa. Second, we're encouraged to see how we can think through both Chinese and Western terms by holding them in critical relation, where their complementarities and contradictions work productively. And third, this opens up the possibility of performing the relation differently, so we can understand how we are both complicit in global problems like climate change and able to engender change. So I'll end here by returning to the metaphor of bridging difference with which we started. So as my former PhD supervisor, William Callahan, recently pointed out, a bridge by its nature connects two or more distinct positions without making them the same. The connection brings about something new in those places. But a good bridge can do so much more than that. As part of a wider landscape, it can provide not just a means for getting from here to there in the quickest way, but a space for beauty and contemplation. So those of you who have been to Beijing's Yuanmingyuan, the old summer palace, will have seen its Western-style ruins, but may also have seen a Chinese-style zigzag bridge like the one that you can see on the screen. This kind of bridge takes those who stroll on it first here and then there to offer different vantage points on the surrounding world from which different vistas and possibilities can be contemplated. This is the kind of bridge that I want to spend my time walking and building, perhaps together with some of you who are listening today. Thank you very much. I will open up to hear thoughts and feedback and provocations from the audience, and gladly do what I can to respond to them.